As I was watching Legend of the Galactic Heroes and we were really getting into knowing Yang Wenli, a quote kept coming to mind, one that I've always found very poetic, although it's kind of ironic who it came from. And this is we have no empire to extend or utopia to establish by, of all people, George W. Bush. And I start off the video with it because I think that more than just about anything else summarizes Yang's character, his personality, his goals, where he fits into the narrative, and how he contrasts with Reinhard. So, Legend of the Galactic Heroes is often brought up as arguably the greatest anime series of all time. For a variety of different reasons, the battles, the sense of realism despite being a sci-fi, the political themes, the historical parallels, all kinds of things that are very beloved about it. But a lot of people will point to the personal and political conflict between Yang and Reinhard as being the absolute heart of the show. It is, and their kind of philosophical differences and the historical forces that they represent as being very much the driving zeitgeist behind it. I have noticed, though, generally speaking, that Yang does not normally get the amount of praise that Reinhard does. He doesn't seem to nearly be as iconic. Like, I don't see very many memes with him compared to Reinhard. And it's not so much people dislike him, but I feel like he's very understated or unappreciated compared to his more flashy rival. And I think that reflects the fan base because Legend of the Galactic Heroes, I wouldn't say is gatekeeped, but it's kind of niche in a sense that it's this super long, super dense, super deep series with all this historical parallels. So you don't get as much of a mainstream audience as you would obviously with something like Naruto. And a lot of the people who are interested in the show and really like it tend to be more conservative or reactionary. And so Reinhard or even someone like Rudolph fits their ideals a lot better as this great man who comes to power and brushes aside degeneracy and decay in a society and restores order and morality. And they view that as the figure who they want to come in, save them, and they map Legend of the Galactic Heroes very much onto current politics. In contrast, Yang believes in liberal democracy. And so he tends to get associated with social liberalism, various left-wing parties, and globalism, at least in the minds of the fans. I'm not saying this is necessarily accurate. I'm just saying I think this is why he receives a lot less attention. Yang is also just a much more complicated character who has a much better developed worldview and a sense of history. And admittedly, I found this video a lot more difficult and it took a lot more time than my Reinhard video. So just to talk about Yang a bit before we get into the rest of it, Yang Wenli is one of the most interesting anime characters of all time, at least for me. At first glance, he seems like this weird mix of very disparate, contradictory traits. He's the greatest military mind of his age, but he hates war. He has really weird mannerisms. He's very introverted, and he seems to have difficulty reading social cues, but he's also incredibly charismatic, and his men love him and will die for him. He's very idealistic in terms of believing that you should do the right thing, even if it's inconvenient, even if it will lead to very poor short-term results. And you can just kind of go through all of these things, and it seems like all these things are very much in conflict within Yang, and he is a very complicated person. And in contrast, Reinhard seems a lot more straightforward. He is this messianic figure who's come to save humanity from its own degeneracy and destruction. And Reinhard doesn't really do things that people around him are surprised by. They might be in awe or excited, or they might be surprised in the sense that he's that daring or that bold. But it's not like Yang where you really have no idea what he's going to do 1 second to the next, because his worldview is fundamentally a lot more complex and kind of opaque. Ironically, though, and we'll get into this, I think Yang is a much more understandable character ultimately than Reinhard is. I think you can say who Yang is, what he wants, where he's going, and all these kind of things that I don't think you can really say about Reinhard, despite him being a lot more complicated, or maybe because he's a lot more complicated. So there was a Yang quote I wanted to start off with. In the long flow of time, living things know nothing of their ancestors except for the genes they inherited. Only mankind has history. Having a history differentiates mankind from all other living species. That is why I wanted to be a historian. So Young is very interesting and kind of unusual in anime because he kind of starts out as a what I call a completed hero or a completed character. He doesn't really have that many developmental arcs in the show. Like we learn more about him, and he gets more worn down and tired or cynical or depressed as the show goes on. But the Young that we see at the beginning of the show is basically the same person as we see at the end. His worldview hasn't changed, his beliefs haven't changed, his general mannerisms haven't changed. And this doesn't come from him being like an uninteresting, flat, or boring character. It comes from him starting out having a very well established sense of self as someone who has developed a very complex worldview, as someone who understands themselves and understands other people. And I think most importantly, he understands the failures of his worldview and how it clashes with reality, and so it's very resilient compared to a lot of characters who are idealistic and immediately give up their ideals when things start to get really bad and it shows they fail in reality. Kind of this level of stability and emotional maturity is normally reserved for mentor characters or wise sages or just kind of people they meet in passing. I can't think of too many cases where you have a main character that has it, and I kind of wish that they would do it more often. Like I said, Young obviously believes in liberal democracy very strongly, but he holds a very cynical and realistic view of it. Like I said, there's no empire to extend, no utopia to establish. And because his view is so flexible and so kind of realistic, even as the alliance falls apart and democracy repeatedly fails, it doesn't fundamentally shake his beliefs because he's studied history, because he's well aware that that is the path that things are likely or inevitably must take. But once again, I find it interesting that with Reinhard, kind of his ultimate objectives, his ultimate moral sense, who he is as a person is very kind of fragmented and kind of difficult to summarize. But with Young, you can pretty much boil it down to one paragraph. Young is a man who hates war and whose ultimate goal was to have lived a quiet life as a historian. Later, this expands a bit where he wants to build a life with Friederike, probably have a family together, but it's really just an extension of it. He wants a quiet life where he can spend his days with his wife and children, reading and writing history books, maybe becoming a professor. And that was his goal at the start of the series. That was his goal prior to the series. That continues to be his goal throughout the series. And we continue to see him try to pursue it unsuccessfully. And once again, that level of consistency I find is something very rare and is what makes him interesting because he's the exception to the rule. So before we get into more of that, I think we have to talk a bit about Young's worldview and political philosophy because, like I said, he's a very intellectual, very theoretical character. So we're going to start off by talking about classical liberalism. So you've probably heard of it before. You've probably heard of liberalism before. There's a lot of different flavors of it, which we're going to talk about. So classical liberalism emerged during the Enlightenment, and kind of at its base form, it focused on, well, liberalism, liberty. Things like, personal liberty, private property rights, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion. It just focused on maximizing the freedom, individual worth, and to a certain degree equality between people. So classical liberalism, at least to my understanding of it, kind of split into two distinct camps over time. You have the more conservative or right liberalism, and then you have social liberalism or progressivism, and they both kind of have a similar base, but they both make very different assumptions about human nature, government, and that sort of thing. So while they initially, and to a certain extent, still support similar policies, they're rooted in very different worldviews. So conservative liberals tend to reject progressivism and the belief that there is an inevitable moral or social advancement to society. Progressives tend to think we're eventually going to reach the end of history, wherein everyone will learn to live together in happiness and there'll be no more war. There's also a rejection of the idea that humans are inherently good. And you can see this idea was also kind of prevalent in Marxism, that eventually, once we achieve a communistic society, the state will just melt away and we won't have any more need for it. Because if we set people free, if we release them from false consciousness, if we release them from economic and political oppression, they will default to their state of nature, which is inherently good. And you see this very commonly in modern progressivism as well. So conservative liberals believed in liberalism, but they also saw tradition, religion, and social structure as being important so long as they were not imposed by the state. That you still needed things that would restrain the individual and would restrain the worst aspects of human nature. And in particular, these things would exist in a way that would allow this structure and kind of enforcement without resorting to state power, without putting the power in the hands of equally corrupt people. So they tended to view government as a necessary evil and liberty as something that could only be preserved through a delicate balance of competing political and social forces. So looking at kind of a comparison between social liberalism and conservative liberalism, so in human nature, social liberals view people as being basically good, but they're corrupted by an unjust system. Whereas in conservative liberalism, people are flawed, self-interested, and in need of some form of constraint. Progressivism says that the important thing is positive rights. That's the freedom to, that's the freedom to have things, or rather positive rights, like you have the right to food, you have the right to health care. In some European countries, there's the right to travel to a foreign country and stuff like that. Whereas in the more right liberal tradition, it's the freedom from things. It's the freedom from government oppression. It's the freedom from land seizure, freedom from censorship, stuff like that. Progressivism tends to see traditional structures like social structures, religion, kind of the institutions that society naturally creates as being a bad thing because they're oppressive, whereas conservative liberals will see these things often as being good. And you'll get into some people, particularly like with the founding fathers, as we'll cover in a minute, who thought you need a moral society that has religious principles and had a strong moral framework, or else it would not function. They just didn't think that that would come from being imposed by the state. So we see the fundamental problem with society in progressivism, it is inequality and exclusion. In right liberalism, it's moral decay, overreach, and centralization. As we'll see in a bit, in a lot of ways, Jung has a very conservative view of history, even if he advocates very liberal, I guess we would say, policies, but the policies kind of come from his conservative view of history. So the role of government is to improve conditions so people can thrive, to actively promote a better future. Whereas in the other case, we have protect against tyranny, uphold order, but also be limited. So social liberals will say democracy is the ideal form of government. Right liberals will have a more kind of cynical that democracy is the worst form of government except all others. Social liberals believe that we will eventually have consistent social and moral progress, whereas right liberals are weary of utopianism and see history as being fundamentally cyclical and tragic, and it's about kind of managing that cyclical and tragic history. So, I covered some of this, but some of the main people who are often cited as being conservative liberals will include Alexis de Tocqueville, Edmund Burke, Adam Smith, and most of the U.S. founding fathers. It was kind of the base ideology of America. You can see this how the U.S. Constitution has all these protections of the individual, all these limits on government. There's all these checks and balances. There was kind of a hope that the different branches would struggle against each other a bit, and that would prevent anyone from gaining supremacy. It was just kind of understood that no form of government, no matter how many laws you put in place, no matter how good your intentions, can survive a corrupt and decadent citizenry. If the people become fundamentally corrupt, it doesn't matter if you have an autocracy or democracy, your society will be corrupt. Free societies only survive so long as the people are moral and they're committed to it. And this has a very cyclical view of history, and Jung will talk about this and we'll get through that quite a bit. But he does say, like, empires rise and fall, there's more free periods, there's less free periods, nothing lasts forever. Change is inevitable. The purpose of you in the here and now is to try to do your best to preserve and extend liberty. And a society where individuals can flourish, it will eventually decline, it will eventually collapse. But for the sake of kind of the most happiness for the most people in the here and now, you have to support it. So interestingly, if you've seen my Reinhard video, Jung supports liberal policies, but has a very conservative view of history. Reinhard, by contrast, is at least on the surface a lot more conservative, but he has a very progressive view of history. And I have a couple of quotes here from some Americans, which I think really kind of summarize how Jung and kind of right liberals view things. We obviously have Benjamin Franklin, a republic if you can keep it. We have another Benjamin Franklin quote: when the people find that they can vote themselves money, that will herald the end of the republic. Abraham Lincoln, as a nation of free men, we must live through all time or else die by suicide. And we just kind of go through the rest of this. Madison says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. And John Adams said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So once again, there's a lot of praise for freedom and individual liberty, but there's also an acknowledgement that it doesn't really matter what they set up. If the people are corrupt and greedy, it's not going to last. So we have the cyclical view of history. So this holds that time does not move in a straight line, but repeats in patterns. And this is a famous series of artworks. I think it's called The Rise and Fall of Empires or something like that, which shows us kind of the rise and fall of Rome. So civilizations will grow, reach a peak, decay, and fall, and then new ones will rise from its ruins. And so history functions like the myth of the phoenix or the changing of the seasons. History is a series of reoccurring moral and political crises that are shaped less by progress, but more by reoccurring flaws in human nature. Interesting, Thomas Carlyle, who also came up with or codified great man theory, put this forward. So it's kind of interesting that he is the origin of both Jung and Reinhardt's worldview. So he said, the death of the old is but the birth of the new. Is not every leaf renewed out of a fallen one? So too must men and nations pass through their appointed seasons of decay, and the world may continue. And this inevitably leads to a form of historical cynicism that there's no utopia and there's no permanent change. So we have a quote from Jung that I think really well summarizes this. Julian, people tend to make the common mistake of believing that a situation will last forever. Try and think about it. The Galactic Empire didn't exist 500 years ago. The history of the free planets is half that length. And Phazon has reached an age of no more than a century. Anything that hasn't existed since the genesis of the universe needn't survive until the end. Change is sure to come. So we just have a couple more Jung quotes that kind of summarize how I think he fits into these categories. Conservative liberalism. Humans can survive without the state, but the state can't exist without humans. The freedom to not get involved is perhaps the most valued freedom we have in this country. I know I'm doing a lot of quotes, but like I said, Jung's philosophy is probably the most important part of his character. And I think it's important to try to dissect it because the show throws a lot of stuff about it, and it kind of took me a while to compile it. So this is a quote I really like. Because only the people themselves have the right to harm the people. In other words, it is clearly the people themselves who are responsible for putting people like Rudolf von Goldenbaum and although much smaller than him, Job Trinchet on power. I can't pronounce it, it should be in power. You cannot blame others. The important thing is that the sin of despotism is that the people can blame others for the evils of politics. Maybe the translation was a little bit rough, but the idea is, in his view, one of the problems of despotism is the people can blame the dictator for all of their personal failings, for all of their sins, where they can anoint this figure to kind of be a sacrifice for them, but also to carry out their wishes. We have another one that I think very much exemplifies it. Following the law is natural as a citizen. However, when the state turns its back on the law that it has set for itself and tries to infringe on individual rights, it is rather a civic sin to cover it up and follow it. Because for citizens of a democratic country, the state, it is because we have the right and the duty to challenge, criticize, and resist the sins and errors committed by government. And here's some cyclical history quotes. There has never been a permanent peace in human history, but there have been plenty of ages with decades of peace. In short, my hope is haughtily enough for a few decades of peace in the future. We covered the one previously. We have, listen carefully, Julian. If human history continues in the future, then the past will accumulate infinitely. History is not only a record of the past, but also evidence that civilization continues to the present. The present civilization is the past. It's built on the accumulation of history, okay? So I think that kind of covers it. So let's get into the character and kind of biography of Jung, now that we kind of have an idea of what he believes in, because the worldview is very important. So Jung Wenli was born in 767 to a civilian merchant family. His mother died very early on when he was about 5, and so he was raised by his father. He spent a lot of his time on board his father's merchant ship, traveling between Hainason and Faison. So his life took a tragic turn. His father died in an accident. It turns out that his father had massively mortgaged the family ship and the shipping company in order to buy this massive prized art collection, which was completely composed of forgeries. So he was raised in a merchant family. His father mortgaged everything in order to buy all this art that turned out to be fake. And so he was left basically penniless. So Jung wanted to become a historian. We've established this. But with no money to pay for university, he enrolled in the Free Planets Alliance Officer Academy purely because it offered to cover tuition in exchange for military service after graduation. They have some variation of the GI Bill. He could go and get a degree. I'm not sure if he got it during his time in military school or was going to be paid for afterwards, but it was really his only way to afford it. So Jung, despite his genius, was a poor to mediocre student in most areas. Particularly, he was extremely bad at piloting, and he barely avoided flunking out, but managed to graduate exactly in the middle of his class. So I think it's because he lacked any kind of motivation. Jung is a genius. Obviously, he's a writer. Later on, his writings are collected into a book that I think is regarded rather highly. He has almost perfect memory. He just wasn't interested or motivated. I think also he was hoping that if he could get do the most mediocre minimum passes, eventually when layoffs came in the military, he would receive an honorable discharge. He could go back to studying history. Unfortunately for Jung, he was cursed with competence, and his morality would not allow him to not act when he had the chance to save people. And because he was the most effective person at acting to save people, it tended to bring him attention, praise, and to his chagrin, promotions. So very early in his year, Jung was stationed at Elfassil, a planet near the Iserlohn corridor. During an imperial invasion, the Alliance Navy fled. Jung stayed behind and managed to evacuate over 3 million civilians. And as he was the only one who performed good in that campaign, He got the title Hero of Alfalsil, and he received multiple promotions to the rank of captain and staff officer, which he was very upset about because it was more unlikely now that the Navy would ever discharge him. So he took part in the Sixth Battle of Iserlohn, where his strategic advice helped to repel Reinhardt's advance. They managed to beat off the Imperial counterattack. Young was like, look, you shouldn't be chasing them. You're going to get into range of the super laser. They're like, no, they won't fire the super laser at their own ships. So they decided to chase the Imperial forces. However, they fired the super laser at their own ships. And the Alliance Navy got largely wiped out. However, because Yang was the only person who happened to be right, he was promoted again as being the sole success during the battle. This was followed up by the Battle of Astarte, in which the Alliance attempted to outmaneuver Reinhard with a plan so simplistic it bordered on insulting. If I recall, they divided their fleet up into like 3 parts, and they were going to try to encircle him or something. I think Reinhard was outnumbered approximately 2-1. So each individual fleet was weaker than his combined fleet. So he was able to, through some good maneuvering, to defeat them in detail, one after another. However, fortunately, a lot of the senior officers died, and Yang was able to assume command and salvage the situation. He was able to successfully withdraw whatever ships were left and saving the thing from being a total loss. It just was a bad defeat instead of a catastrophic one. He got another title, the Hero of Astarte, and was promoted to Rear Admiral, unfortunately. Young's career is kind of the opposite of Reinhardt's in a case, wherein Reinhardt always sought the most prestigious assignments and was actively trying to get promoted as quickly as possible. Young just happened to be in the right place at the right time and consistently kept being in the right place at the right time. And when he was the only one who was capable of acting, he wound up drawing attention to himself and getting promoted because in the Alliance hierarchy, which was full of just tons and tons of incompetent people, he was really the only shining star. It was also during this time when Frederica brought him a sandwich and a cup of coffee. He was being young and he said, you should have brought me tea. I hate coffee. And he choked on the sandwich. However, despite this, or probably perhaps because of it, Frederica fell in love with him on the spot, and her affection for him would continue on for the rest of both of their lives. So, take a little peek at what's happening over in the Empire, wherein a similar kind of phenomenon was happening. The Imperial Alliance War of 794 marked a turning point in galactic history. Much of the older generation of officers died off or were discredited, which led to a new cohort of junior officers, including Reinhard, Mittermeier, Young, and Ruenthal, to rise to prominence. During this period, Reinhard and Young were both rapidly promoted. As with Young, I said he kind of experienced the reverse of failing upward. The relentless incompetence of his superiors kept landing him into higher positions, much to his annoyance. It's interesting because Reinhard active pursuit of power and Young actively avoiding it. Despite that, they kind of found themselves in similar positions at the top of their respected military, as well as being widely trusted and extremely popular. So both Young and Reinhardt were in positions, if they wanted to seize power in a military coup. However, Young was assigned the unenviable task of capturing Iserlohn, which he succeeded in doing through subterfuge and covert operations without incurring a single casualty, which earned him the nickname Miracle Young, and that would be his main nickname for the rest of his life. So his hope was that the capture of Iserlohn, being arguably the most strategically important location in the galaxy, would enable the Alliance to negotiate a treaty with the Empire on favorable terms. The Empire never acknowledged the Alliance existence, so Young was hoping maybe there would be a white peace involving the alliance giving Iserlohn back to the Empire in exchange for diplomatic recognition and kind of the establishment of a status quo. He even attempted to retire, not for the first time, but as against his objections, the alliance launched a catastrophic invasion of the Empire, which led to a loss of about 60% of their ships. Keep in mind that the alliance always had less industrial capacity and a smaller fleet than the Empire, so this is a complete and total disaster. They also lost even higher percentage of their experienced crews. Even if they could rebuild the ships, getting back trained and experienced crews was something that would take years, if not decades, to replace. This disaster led to the collapse of the current administration, and Job Truncheon came to power with another extremely unpopular government. So despite the fact that the Alliance High Command had completely failed, I think they gave like this unstable guy, I forget his name, the responsibility of coming up with the strategy, and it was largely just like a hope strategy. It's kind of like something the Americans would do in the 21st century, where they're like, well, we'll just be viewed as liberators and the local people flock to us, and the empire will just kind of disintegrate in the wake of mass uprisings. And when that obviously didn't happen, there was no plan B. The public, however, blamed the civilian leadership, saying that they were corrupt and incompetent, which is 100% accurate. And they began to see the military, and indeed the military itself, began to see it as the only hope for the alliance's survival. That is, the military shifted blame to the civilian leadership. They said the war was their fault, although it was obviously also largely the military's fault. And they said, we are not going to be able to survive the current conflict with the corrupt and incompetent civilian leadership. And so this led to the Alliance Civil War, which Young predicted. He told Bucock, yeah, there's going to be a coup soon. The civilian government is completely discredited. If there's any public faith left, it's in the military. There's going to be very few objections from the population if they seize power. Of course, as per normal, no one listened to Young, and there was a coup that established the National Salvation Military Council, which established a national security state. Civil rights were suspended. The economy they attempted to institute total economic mobilization to continue the war. Young, however, foiled their plans. Basically, the entirety of the remaining alliance military either sided with the junta or decided to remain neutral. Young and his fleet were the only ones who stayed loyal to the civilian government. And as he was really the only admiral who mattered, other than maybe Bucock, he was able to win the Alliance Civil War basically on his own. He destroyed a much larger pro-junta force and succeeded in restoring civilian rule and undoing the military junta, albeit he had to destroy, I think it was called Artemis's necklace, which was the planetary defense systems that will come back to haunt him later on. So after civilian rule was restored, he got imprisoned and humiliated by the restored government, who thought that Yang might lead his own coup. Yang once again tried to resign, only to be reinstated in the face of a renewed imperial invasion. So they were asking him all these questions. They were humiliating him. They were saying that he was going to carry out a coup and stuff like that. And Yang was like, look, I just want to go back to writing history books. If you want me to resign, I'll resign and I'll just go off and do whatever. I always like to think that if Yang had wrote a history books, he would have either written a book series called Legend of the Galactic Heroes or The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire or some other ironic title. So just kind of an interlude, because we brought this up a couple of times. One of the defining characteristics of Yang is a rejection of power. And arguably his rejection of power and refusal to carry out a coup is what dooms the alliance. Once again, he's very aware of this irony himself, that if he had seized power at some point, at a number of different points throughout the show, he might have been able to stabilize the alliance and prevent its utter defeat by the Empire later on. But for Yang, that wasn't really worth it. because the principle to him was more important. So while Reinhardt was able to take swift control, reform the state, purge incompetent leaders, and get the economy and bureaucracy back on a stable footing, Yang continued to defer to a series of increasingly disastrous administrations that squandered the alliance's admittedly very limited military resources and ultimately led to its complete destruction and annexation. There's a number of scenes in the show where his staff basically just begs him to launch a coup. They're like, look, these guys have no idea what they're doing. The junta doesn't know what they're doing. The civilian government doesn't. These people are completely nuts. Young, you're the only one who can save the alliance. Please launch a coup. And people are just begging him. And I'd imagine if he had have launched a coup, declared a state of emergency, and assumed temporary control, I imagine basically the entire civilian and military civilian population and military outside of the very top of the hierarchy would have backed him, and he would have come to power with immense amounts of unity and political capital. He, of course, did not do that. So there's a couple different places in the show where he could have seized military power if he really wanted to. And while Yang is the most, in my opinion, the best commander in the series, at least on a tactical level, he needs something to work with. He can win against impossible odds, but he needs something to win against impossible odds with. During Operation Ragnarok, he was outnumbered approximately 20-1, and he still managed to basically win that campaign. But if it had even been like a 5-3 ratio or a 2-1 ratio, he might have been able to do something with that. He might have been able to pull off a couple miracle victories and succeeded in destroying the Imperial fleet, at least probably at great loss, though, but made it so that the Empire would not be able to complete its invasion alliance territory and might have withdrawn. So his first opportunity to launch a coup was right before the invasion of Imperial space. This is kind of an unfavorable moment, but he correctly predicted the campaign would doom the alliance. He did have a lot of popularity as a result of the capture of Iserlohn, and some people might argue, even if it was unlikely to succeed, he should have done that, as that led to the destruction of, like I said, over 60% of the alliance's armed forces in one campaign in a very short period of time. His second chance, which I think is probably the easiest one, was to carry out a coup immediately after the invasion had failed. He led the only successful battle of the campaign, and I think he could have marched on the capital and seized power with very little opposition. Once again, I think the public probably would have supported him, and a lot of the military, who was probably aware of the fact that he had explained why this was a bad idea, would have decided to throw in their lot with him instead of the incompetent commanders who got them massacred. He could have moved before the military council did and set up a government at that point. His third chance came after the Civil War, after he had managed to defeat the junta. There was basically no government at that point in time. If he had declared himself, I don't know, like protector or interim president, or I don't know, given himself some sort of title, I think there would have been zero opposition, and he very easily could have seized control, not even seized control, but just been given control of the alliance at that point in time. Now, at that point, the alliance military was so depleted, it's doubtful if even Yang could have stopped Operation Ragnarok, but he might have been able to do something. He might have been able to blunt it enough so that it ended with an unfavorable peace treaty, maybe with the Empire taking a bunch of systems on their side of the galaxy, but not enough for them to decisively win and result in the situation that wound up happening. Maybe a fourth opportunity was at the Battle of Vermillion, where he had the chance to kill Reinhard. And if he had have done that, he could have seized power in the alliance and started rebuilding it to make it secure so that whoever Reinhardt's successor is couldn't just waltz in and curb stomp them. Even after the alliance collapses, Yang refuses to lead the government in exile, believing that the military has to be subject to the civilian government. regardless of how unpopular or incompetent that they are. No one even knew who like the government in exile was. They were just literal nobodies and losers. And Yang was really the only person of any note who wound up joining them. But like I said, because he didn't want to end the precedent, he didn't do that. So there's an interesting quote that I think also describes Yang very well. So upon hearing that Washington was going to retire after his time in office, George III said, that is obviously the King of Britain and the man who's blamed for starting the American Revolution, said, if he retires, he will be the greatest man in the world. That is, willingly giving up basically what could have been absolute power. After the revolution, Washington was very clearly the leader of the country. If he had have asked to have been made king, it probably would have been given to him. He could have been president for life. He could have basically just done whatever he wanted. But Washington really was not interested in that. He wanted to go back to Mount Vernon and be a gentleman farmer. He hated politics. He hated governing the country. And you can say what you will about the system in America, but Washington's precedent of a stable and peaceful transition of power has done a lot to keep the U.S. stable for the last couple hundred years. And being able to walk away when you're at the top of your power, when you're at the top of your game, and leave on a good note is something that very few politicians or very few people have succeeded in achieving throughout human history. So, ironically, Yang would have been an ideal dictator. He would have been, as Reinhard might have said, the greatest man in the universe for stepping down from power. He would not have held it any longer than necessary. So it would have looked more like a Roman-style emergency dictatorship than a modern authoritarian regime. Yang would probably say, I will hold power for a year or X amount of time. He would make sure to have the civilian government approve it, with the understanding that he would step down as soon as his term ran out or the crisis was over. But it wouldn't have really left any, I think, lasting political impact on the alliance. So a Yang dictatorship would probably have been more democratic than the system it replaced. There probably would be a purging of the corrupt elites and the various traitors and people who were destroying the alliance's political structure. And then there would probably be elections almost immediately, which would probably be substantially more free and fair and open than the elections that had happened in the last couple of cycles. He would have accepted the civilian government as being legitimate, and almost everything in society would be left up to them to govern as it had prior to the war, or the current phase of the war. So Yang likely would have only gained control of the military strategy and foreign policy, leaving the rest of the government completely in civilian hands, so long as he was given autonomy to fight the war and they approved whatever his defense budgets were. So because he despised war and exercise of power, there's really no question he would have stepped down once the crisis was passed. I don't think it would have created the precedent for a long-term dictatorship, and may have even made it harder in the future for someone to have emergency powers and to not step down. So why is it that Yang didn't want to do this? Yang's refusal to seize power and override civilian control of the military has puzzled a lot of people, both viewers and characters within the series. As discussed, there were several moments when he could have intervened and saved his nation, but he chose not to. So the restraint comes from Yang's long-term historical perspective. To him, the Alliance and the Empire are temporary constructs, but the example one sets can echo through time. I mean, the fact that we're still talking about Washington or Cincinnatus, if we're talking about the Roman context, or Diocletian, just shows how long these examples can persist for hundreds or thousands of years after they actually happened. As he put it, tyrants rise and fall, nations weather crises, but upholding the principle, even when it's inconvenient, leaves an eternal legacy. He also believed, at least my impression, in the democracy of the dead, which is a common conservative thing, wherein the responsibility for society, or whether there is a duty to previous generations that you inherit their wishes, aspirations, and values, and it's your duty to maintain them and to preserve them and to pass it on to the next generation. And he didn't want to set this precedent of it being okay for the military to seize power and override civilian government, and to him not setting that precedent and basically fulfilling the dreams of his forefathers who had wanted a free and democratic state, and then passing that example down to the next generation was more important than the survival of the alliance. So we have a couple, I think, really good quotes here that summarize this. This is from Alexander Bukock. If Jung were to ever be defeated, it wouldn't be by the great genius of Kaiser Reinhard. It would be by his adherence to his own ideals. So this is a Jung quote about why he won't seize power. If we don't plant seeds just because they'll wither someday, there's no chance that the grass will grow. Also, we can't go without eating meals just because we'll eventually get hungry. Anyway, once the roots of Republican democracy get pulled out, it'll be more difficult for them to grow again. Even if it might take several centuries, I want to lighten the burden of the next generation somewhat. So once again, it's this idea that Republican democracy and individual freedom is something they inherited from the previous generations, and it's something that they don't have the right to destroy, and it's something that they have the duty to pass on to the next. And here's just a very direct summary of that. If we have to leave something to the next generation as a legacy, wouldn't peace be the best? And it is the responsibility of the next generation to maintain the peace inherited from the previous generation. Once again, the great chain of being, the democracy of the dead. If each generation does not forget its responsibility to the one to come, it will eventually maintain peace for a long time. If we forget, the legacy of our ancestors will be eaten away, and humanity will be the first. I think that's another translation issue, but you get the idea. So we head into the Battle of Vermillion. This is basically the same slide as what we had in the Reinhard one. So Jung was assigned to defend Iserlohn during Operation Ragnarok. He, however, correctly predicted that Reinhard would instead advance through the Phazon corridor. As usual, his advice was ignored, and Reinhard's forces entered Alliance territory unopposed. Had Jung remained at home, had he not basically been put into exile and sent off, who knows, he might have achieved a victory or at least a stalemate. There was still some Alliance forces left, even if they were outnumbered like 5 or 6 to 1. Who knows, Jung is a miracle worker. He might have been able to do something with that. So Jung was away. Admiral Bukock succeeded in getting a group of older volunteers together and made a last stand, which is one of my favorite battles in the series. He eventually lost, but he achieved like a more than 2-to-1 casualty ratio against a much larger force. And with the destruction of that, the Alliance's main fleet was gone. The only fleet left of any significant sizes was Jung's. So Jung came to the conclusion that the only way to beat Reinhard and to save the Alliance was to kill Reinhard directly. There is no heir, there is no chain of succession. Reinhard's new empire was still very young. So he figured if we kill Reinhard, there will be a succession crisis. The invasion will either get called off or it'll get disorganized and there'll be warlords and infighting and stuff like that. But it's really the only way we're going to be able to resolve this. So Jung understood the psychology of Reinhard. He understood Reinhard's messianic complex, that he was a deeply romantic man, and that if he was able to offer Reinhard a one-on-one battle, that Reinhard would eventually take it because he had to defeat his nemesis man on man. So Jung launched a series of guerrilla strikes on supply lines, which basically ground the Imperial invasion to a halt and achieved kind of a soft stalemate. I think the Empire was still moving forward, but it was a massive pain and they were continually running out of supplies. So he came to the conclusion that, yeah, Reinhard would eventually put himself on a vulnerable position, kind of like with the second Death Star in Return of the Jedi, in order to lure Jung out and defeat him in decisive combat. So we had the Battle of Vermillion. Jung technically won it. However, Reinhardt's admirals just bypassed the whole fight and took the capital, capturing the civilian leadership of the alliance and forcing them to surrender, in which Young surrendered, unfortunately, moments before killing Reinhardt and saving his beloved liberal democracy and Free Planets Alliance. Probably one of the more ironic moments in the series is Reinhardt offered Young, I think it was a position as a fleet admiral, actually, as what the highest position within the Imperial Navy, because he really respected him and really wanted him to work for him, and ultimately to kind of be his friend. Young declined because he wanted to leave the military. He said, look, I really just want to retire. I'm not going to get in your way. Just let me go off with Frederica and have a quiet life reading history books. And that's all I really care about. And Reinhardt's like, you know what? That's okay. I'm not even mad, bro. I have mad respect for you. You can go and retire. So, just a little bit of an interlude regarding Reinhard van Lohengrin. Young's view of Reinhard is very interesting because he really likes Reinhard, both as a person and as a ruler. I cannot recall him ever actually insulting Reinhard. His objections are basically just ideological and philosophical. In fact, he says repeatedly the main danger of Reinhard is that he is such a decent guy and a good governor, and that's what makes him so toxic and corrosive to Young's ideology, because it's showing that dictatorship can work, and it's not necessarily brutal and destructive and corrupt. He repeatedly praises Reinhardt's reforms, integrity, and regard for human life. He says he's a much better leader than anyone in the alliance, but he still feels morally bound to oppose him as an autocrat. So Young's criticism is not so much that autocracy is inherently bad. I think he says it's only a form of government and people make of it what they will. But he feels that the incompetence and diffusion of democracy, wherein power is spread out and it's not centralized in any one man, kind of results in a consistently average government or a consistently mediocre government. Wherein with autocracy, sometimes you'll get a man like Reinhard who will carry out immense reforms and completely revitalize society. Or you'll get, like with a lot of the Golden Bombs, a series of lazy, decadent, incompetent, or even cruel rulers. And the amount of damage they can do is there's nothing to mitigate how much they can really wreck society in a way that democratic governments can't. So we have a couple quotes here. I find this one very interesting. If I had have been born in the Empire, I would have volunteered to join your excellency, even if you hadn't asked. Once again, I find that's a very kind of conservative way of looking at it. He's like, look, I was born in the Alliance. My political culture is Republican democracy. But on a personal level, I think you're way more competent than my leadership. If I had been born in the Empire, I would have been one of your first supporters. I would have been one of your most devoted supporters. It just happens that because of historical accident, I was born where I was born, and I'm fated to be your opponent. So Young says because Kaiser Reinhardt is a brilliant ruler, he is the worst enemy of Republican democracy. Reinhardt is a threat because he's succeeding in changing history with power that is not democratic. He even says, strange, isn't it, liking an enemy commander better than our own politicians. And then he acknowledges freely kind of some of the contradictions of his ideas. When the absolute majority of the people affirm and accept autocracy, we who advocate for the sovereignty of the people become the enemy of the people. If we have to bring down a virtuous ruler to preserve the institution of democracy, democracy becomes the enemy of good governance. We have no choice but to laugh at such a paradox. Because as he put it, like, Reinhardt was overwhelmingly popular. Like, if you had a referendum on him being confirmed as emperor, he'd probably get like 80% of the vote. Whereas the alliance government was incompetent and widely despised by the majority of the people. So it's kind of the question of which is more democratic, the one that has overwhelming public support or the one that is not supported but has the particular institutions. And then this gets into how do we define democracy? How do you balance democracy against republicanism? And these are all very difficult questions. So we're going to take an interlude with who I think personally is best girl, and that is for Frederica Greenhill Young. So during his university days, Young developed feelings for Jessica Edwards, who also had a crush on him, but she played hard to get, and Young isn't good at mixed messages. And his best friend, Lap, said, "Look, I'm interested in her. Do you mind if I pursue her?" And Young is like, "Yeah, you can have her, man. I love you, bro. I don't." She's sending me mixed messages. I don't understand mixed messages. Go ahead. So they wind up getting married, and Young gets left in the dust. There's this weird idea I've seen that Young is asexual. I don't get that at all. There's no evidence in universe for this as far as I can tell. He was clearly attracted to Jessica, and he was clearly attracted to Frederica from the first time he saw her. Like when he saw her for the first time, he was obviously kind of taken by her beauty. It's just that Young is very insular, kind of autistic, and has kind of difficulty probably conceptualizing that type of relationship. I'd also imagine, and once again, I'm not entirely sure, he's just not very motivated by sexual desire in the way that some other people are. And once again, this is not uncommon for a lot of men in history. It doesn't mean that they're asexual or they don't have desires for women. There's also just a lot of other stuff going on. There's a sense of guilt. There's a sense of the age gap, which actually isn't really that big. And that he believes that he is going to die relatively soon. So Young and Frederica first met during Young's evacuation of El Fasil. As I said, she was one of the people he saved. When they first spoke, Frederica brought him a coffee. Young dryly remarked he wished it had been a tea, to just kind of like, I guess, kind of sarcastically screw with her a bit. He later apologized for it. Frederica basically fell in love with him after that. It would persist for years. Because she was inspired by Young, she joined the military. She placed second in her class at the Free Planets Alliance Officers Academy and was assigned as Young's adjutant, largely due to her eidetic memory. So she kind of achieved her goal. She got to be in a position where she could help her man. I'm pretty sure that Young was fairly early aware of her feelings towards him. He's not oblivious. Like I said, he just felt guilty because he was involved in the death of her father, who had led the coup. And he didn't want to, like, he didn't really want the distraction, but he also just felt it was unfair if he married Frederica because he was pretty sure that he was going to die relatively quickly. So something I like is I find their relationship to be one of the most mature, and I don't know if realistic is the right term, but I just really like how their relationship works. They act more like an actual couple who are different in some ways and similar in a lot of ways. And they just kind of complement each other. I'm happy whenever like a happy marriage is portrayed on screen, because particularly in modern media, they're almost always shown to be like depressing. The couple hates each other. There's no affection. There's no passion. Just that marriage is like this death trap that is something to be avoided at all costs. So when Frederica met Young, she basically just started acting like his wife from day one. And I think people even remarked on that in universe. She balanced out his worst impulses with patience and firmness, honestly. And maybe this is a little bit cringy, but I kind of think Frederica would probably be pretty much the perfect wife, to be honest, other than her cooking skills. But she was working on that. She wanted to learn to cook nicer meals for Young because her early attempts were pretty disastrous. So Young is a brilliant strategist and a decent guy. Like Young's a good guy deep down, or not even deep down, just when you meet him. But he's also extremely lazy, disorganized, and prone to neglecting his health and responsibilities, like oversleeping, staying up late, drinking a lot of alcohol, not eating properly, not showing up to appointments. Basically, he finds it extremely hard to maintain anything resembling a routine. And Frederica was just like, no, you're going to do this. You're going to get up. You're going to put your uniform on. You're going to go to this meeting, and I'm going to make sure that you do it. and she was very gentle. She was very polite, but she was also very firm and forceful. And I think that Young probably appreciated that, that she kind of helped to mitigate his kind of worst impulses. I mean, as far as bad impulses go, that's pretty light. It's not like Yang was hedonistic or greedy or power hungry or anything, but he did kind of need a good woman to keep him in line, as it were. So more than that, Frederica was one of the few people Jan could have real conversations with. And unlike Reinhard with Hilda, he really bonded with her on like an intellectual and personal level. She was very intelligent, maybe not quite as intelligent as Young, but Young is like an unrivaled genius. So she would be like in the very intelligent category, but maybe not the genius level. But she was also just a lot more grounded. There's the cringy term emotional intelligence, but she definitely had that. She also had eidetic memory, so she was able to recall a lot of details. But Yang was someone like who could sit down and have long conversations with her. He found her interesting. And I think more than probably anything else, other than just being beautiful, that really attracted him to her. That is something I find with a lot of historical figures, that the thing they ultimately wind up looking for in a woman is someone who's like interesting, like someone who they can have a conversation with, who's like intelligent and stuff like that. Because a lot of the time they'll go through like a hedonistic phase where they go through like a lot of just the most attractive women possible, and then they just kind of become jaded and cynical about that. That is actually a reason I've seen in a lot of cases for why people don't get married, is they just find women very boring. So Young decided that it wasn't fair to Frederica or himself to keep her waiting indefinitely. So prior to the Battle of Vermillion, which he knew was going to be the end of the war, he proposed to her. Most of the crew thought that they were already married because she basically acted like his wife, or at least engaged. Frederica was a little bit surprised that Young finally kind of got the courage to do it, but she was pretty sure they were going to get married eventually. Young loved her, and Frederica loved him, and they both knew that they had feelings for each other. It's just like, well, to be fair to Young, he is kind of fighting a existential war that will decide the fate of humanity. So I think we can give him a little bit of a pass for seeming oblivious or not making his move quicker. So we get to see a little bit of Young's dream because he was forced to retire after the Battle of Vermillion, which is really what he wanted. He reminds me a bit of Shikamaru, actually, if you've seen Naruto, wherein he's a genius, but he's just extremely unambitious and kind of lazy. Unlike most characters in the series or people of his intelligence in other animes who seek conquest or historical change, Yang didn't really care about that much. He'll fight to protect democracy, but it's not his goal in life. Once again, his dream is retire from the military, marry Frederica, have a bunch of kids, and spend his days writing history books, probably with Frederica editing for them, and just kind of live a happy, harmonious marriage with her and die as an old man in his bed surrounded by his children and grandchildren. That's ultimately, I think, what Yang wanted out of life. And he was always very clear on that. And that did not change from the beginning of the series to the end of the series. Like I said, his dream grew to include Frederica as well, as his initial dream, but it was always just very much a good life. He wanted to live a good life, not a great one. Part of the irony is also that this is a very attainable dream. All the pieces for it were there. It was just kind of putting them together, and it was like a very simple set of instructions. It's like a Lego kit with maybe 12 parts or something. I mean, all the issues, all the different pieces were there. He was just never able to have the chance to sit down and fit them together. And it is really sad because when we see him briefly in civilian life with Frederica, they're an extremely happy couple. Frederica is a very loving wife. For the rest of the series, she always calls him darling or love or uses some affectionate name for him. They don't fight. Obviously, she she kind of firmly makes him pick up after himself or go to meetings or interact with people or meet guests. but she doesn't do it in really a nagging way. I find with female characters, there's a difference between being nagging and breaking balls and just like having to be the responsible one. Like in Avatar, I found that a lot with Katara. Like I'm sure some people think that she was very naggy, but she just kind of had to be like the voice of reason, and she had to deal with Sokka and Toph and Yang, none of whom are necessarily the most responsible, logical, clear-minded people. Well, Sokka is logical, but he's more of a big picture guy. So Katara had to deal with a lot of just the logistics and the basic day-to-day stuff. And it makes sense that she got frustrated and had to try to keep kind of the rest of the group in line. So it's to me, it's the difference is whether it's justified or not, and whether it's kind of proportionate. So I didn't really see Frederica nag Yang much, but if she did occasionally like do a bit of that, it was probably necessary to keep him in line. And like I said, it's sad to see such like a nice, harmonious marriage. Frederica, as I said, I think honestly almost be a perfect wife. I think she'd raise very well-adjusted, well-educated, morally upright kids. I think Yang, even if he's a little scatterbrained, would be a very doting father. And once again, this is kind of in contrast to Reinhard, because with Reinhard, he was never really sure if he would have been happier had he not become emperor, had he have just stayed with Kirkais and his sister back on Odin in a relatively simple life. And even towards the end, he constantly wonders about it. Whereas, like I said, Yang always wanted the same thing. And from what little we saw, he would have been perfectly happy with that for the rest of his life. So yeah, I think Frederica would have helped him with his work. Like I said, she seems like the kind of woman who would wake Yang up, say, "You've got 20 minutes, breakfast is ready, the shuttle comes at 9. I laid your uniform out, you better get dressed and go." And Yang would groan and complain, but be deeply grateful. So as Yang was in retirement, finally living the good life, we have the wood shopping, your country needs you seed. So Yang was denied his retirement, and through a convoluted web of 40 chess political maneuvers from various different parties, he got dragged back into action. So he was almost executed by the collaborationist government that had been set up after the end of Operation Ragnarok. However, he escaped Hennison thanks to Frederica, who, in a really badass move, came in and shot the guy who was about to kill him. And he was able to reunite with his own fleet. The complete political shit show led to Operation Ragnarok 2 Electric Boogaloo. And Reinhard invaded again, and this time outright annexed the Alliance. El Fasel, the planet where Yang had made his name, declared independence and formed a revolutionary government. They invited Yang to join them, hoping to harness his legend for legitimacy, because they were just kind of a bunch of random losers who no one cared about. So the more things change. So Yang and Merkatz, through a series of psychological manipulations, 4D chess plans, and a bunch of other stuff, were able to conquer Iserlohn again, giving him a base of operations to continue the struggle with the Empire again. Sorry, I got confused earlier because Bukak made 2 heroic last stands. He made one during Operation Ragnarok 1, but I was describing his last stand in Operation Ragnarok 2. They both went very similar, where he did better than he had any right to do so. Bukak deliberately kept Yang out of the loop and went to fight the battle before Yang could join forces with him, because he knew that even with Yang, there was no way that they were going to win, and he'd rather have him survive and stay at Iserlohn and be the hope of Republican democracy that would stay alive despite the defeat of the Alliance at large. So after Bukak lost, the remnants of the remnants of the remnants made their way to Yang, which gave him a decently sized fleet. I think about 10,000 ships, which is small, but it's still a actual fleet. It's not just like a band of raiders. So Yang is smart enough to know that the situation was hopeless. There's no way he could defend Al Fasel. He could probably defend Iserlohn indefinitely, so long as the Empire didn't pull a 4D chess move of their own and managed to retake it through subterfuge. So his goal became to win a victory, or at least try to improve the situation where he had come up with some sort of negotiated surrender, or a some sort of peace deal that was better than them just giving up and going to imperial prison camps. With the rest of the galaxy under his control, Reinhard made preparations for the assault on Iserlohn. That would be the last battle of the current war, and probably the last battle of the Empire Alliance War that had lasted well over a century at this point. So we have the endgame, Yong's last battle, and which I consider to be his greatest battle. And I got that detail wrong. He had 20,000 ships, although he had 10,000 left at the end. So he managed to bluff the Empire into believing that his fleet was several times larger than it was. And Iserlohn is one of two corridors. Reinhardt's forces were pretty much all in the Free Planet Alliance territory, and to get back into Imperial territory, he would have to go to the Galactic South and then go through Phazon and then make his way back up. So Yang made it look like he was going to invade Imperial territory. Obviously, he wasn't going to try to grab any land, but with the fleet size that Reinhardt thought he would have, he could do a lot of damage. He could go from planet to planet, burn them, take the resources, move to the next one, and it would be just a massive headache that Reinhardt didn't want to deal with. So if my understanding is correct, Reinhardt launched an offensive against Iserlohn from the Alliance side of the corridor, and I'm not entirely sure if the goal was just to surround it, if he had his own plan to try to take it, but Yang decided that he would have to give a fight at this point in time. He had mined a lot of the corridor. The Empire had a special weapon that let them get through it. So we had just this brutal battle where they were fighting in the corridor. The reason it was very advantageous is because it was so narrow, kind of like Yang's Thermopylae, wherein the Empire was not able to bring its full might against him. They outnumbered him 5-1, but they could only bring a small number of ships up at a time, and they would risk bumping into each other, and retreat in advance were very difficult. And even Reinhard and Ruenthal up against Yang weren't able to make their normal brilliant stratagems or any kind of special maneuvers, and so it just came down to a grinding attritional warfare. Even so, it looked like that the Empire was just going to win through sheer weight of numbers, as even if Yang was outmaneuvering them, their ships were still firing and they had a massive numeric advantage. So the battle actually went on for days. Reinhardt collapsed from a combination of exhaustion and the early stages of his illness, with no sign of Yang's forces breaking. Mittermeier and Ruenthal made the decision to withdraw and wait for Reinhardt to recover. The irony is that Yang was hours away from conceding, as his fleet was completely wrecked, and his troops were basically falling asleep. My guess is that the Empire could rotate crews out after a day or two, because they had a much larger fleet and keep them fresh. But there's only so long, even with stimulants, that people can continue to fight effectively. And we get this really cool scene of when they get back to Iserlohn, everyone just collapses in like elevators and on the decks and stuff like that, and few people even make it back to their rooms. So while Reinhard is passed out, he has a vision of Kirkais, who comes to him and tells him he needs to seek peace with Yang and offer him his friendship. And I covered this a bunch in the Reinhard video, how Yang might be the only person who Reinhard ever saw as truly his equal, as someone who could understand him, and as the only person who is truly worthy of killing him. And that the only real way that Reinhard could prove that he was best, that he could prove that he was the Messiah, that he could prove that he was the man of destiny, is if he was able to beat Yang in one-on-one combat. However, things were not to be. Reinhard offered Yang peace talks on equal footing, which was Yang's war aim. They could hopefully negotiate maybe for the Hessian sector to be autonomous, come up with something, get something that allowed some vestiges of liberal democracy to continue on. maybe they would be able to have local elections or something like that. So Young set off for negotiations with a small crew. However, due to some behind the scenes ops, a group of terrorists, and yes, that pun is always funny, boarded the ship and slaughtered the crew. Young himself was shot in the leg by an unnamed terrorist and bled out alone in the ship's corridor. His last words were, "Sorry, Frederica. Sorry, Julian. Sorry, everyone." Interestingly, later on, Frederica would say those were probably his last words. She would say his last words were probably "Sorry, everyone," which was correct. Reinhard went into a severe depression afterwards. It became his biggest lasting regret that he could never defeat Young, kill him in battle, or die at his hands. I think that Young, if he was looking down or looking back at it and known that was how he would end, he probably would have been more amused by it than anything. In a way, it serves as kind of a fitting anticlimax to Young's career. He was a man who was idealized, basically canonized, viewed as the greatest genius from a strategic standpoint and hero of his age. But he always hated that. And once again, he always had the view that history was extremely long term, that the individual deeds of people didn't ultimately matter much. He was not a romantic in kind of the ideological worldview sense. So the idea of him just dying in a random corridor shot by an unnamed faceless mook, I think would have actually amused him and said, yeah, that's correct. Real life doesn't work like movies. I just kind of die in a very nondescript way. So also kind of ironically, Young died as a undefeated eternal martyr of democracy because he was never beaten in battle, but died under kind of very kind of pathetic circumstances. His legend was able to persist that he hadn't actually legitimately lost, which is true. He had been defeated by subterfuge and behind the scenes ops. So, in the aftermath of that, the al-Fashi revolutionary government immediately collapsed, leaving Iserlohn in the hands of rebel forces as the only remaining territory not controlled by Reinhard. They formed the Iserlohn Republic, and most of the remaining military deserted, leaving the Iserlohn Republic as a rump of a rump of a rump. Frederica managed to pull herself together. I think that was very impressive given how much she loved Young. And she resigned from the military and became the civilian head of the Republic. Young's adopted son and protege, Julian, was named commander of what little was left, despite only being a lieutenant. He was seen as the logical successor to Young, having been trained in his methods and being able to think the most like him out of anybody. So Young was more or less canonized as the eternal hero of the Republic and the champion of democracy. His sayings were compiled into a book, much like another person who had very different political views. Sayings were compiled into a book, and a cult of personality formed around his memory. While Young may have understood the necessity of this, he never saw himself as a hero, just a man who killed to protect those he loved, and he always very acutely felt guilt for all the blood on his hands. He despised framing like this, that history was a fight between good and evil. It's normally a fight between multiple goods. And it just isn't kind of as simplistic as this sort of myth making would indicate. Ultimately, Young was deeply humanistic in a lot of ways, and his ideals reflect a desire to restrain government rather than to pursue any kind of grand idealized vision of the future. So Julian became head of the remnants of the remnants of the remnants of the remnants of the Alliance and offered battle to Reinhard in the last battle, the last known battle in human history, despite being severely outnumbered. However, at the time, Reinhard was dying and was not nearly at the top of his game. His best victories were long since behind him at this point. So Reinhard, so Julian came out and gave Reinhard one final battle. Julian was able to use a lot of Yang as tricks. They did not have enough crew for their ships, so they set some of them on to basically auto collide with the Imperial fleet. They succeeded in tricking them and outmaneuvering them. And Julian saw, much as with the Battle of Vermillion, the only way that he was able to get out of this was to do what Yang had done at Vermillion, to reach Reinhardt directly, and in this case, to appeal to him, to ask, to stand before him as an equal, and to demand terms, not as like a defeated enemy, but as I don't know if you want to call it a conditional surrender or whatever it is. Reinhardt decided to give battle. When Julian succeeded in boarding his ship, Reinhard did not take any kind of exceptional attempts to defend himself. If anything, I kind of get the impression that he was hoping Julian would kill him, and so he could die at the hands of a man he respected. If he couldn't die at the hands of Yang anymore, dying at the hands of Julian was probably the next best thing. Julian managed to reach him aboard the ship, demanded peace negotiations on equal footing, to which Reinhard duly agreed. The final terms were left up to Hilda and Alexander, Reinhardt's son. It appears that the Balat Star Zone, including the planet Hessian, were allowed to exist as an autonomous democratic republic, ultimately preserving the ideals Yang fought for intact for future generations. While it was only a small piece of what had once been the Alliance, it would remain as a lasting example of an alternative form of government and a different way of life, which is, as I said, what Yang had wanted to accomplish before his assassination: limited autonomy, a better peace deal than anything they really could have hoped for. So we come to the question, who was Yang? While he was a complicated man, he was also very straightforward. He remained true to who he was and what he believed in, despite the immense challenges he faced. Yang began the series as a complete person, fully at peace with who and what he was, which gave him the confidence and strength to endure constant betrayals and setbacks. As for his ideals, Yang was both a utilitarian and a humanist. He believed in people rather than systems, he believed in systems, that's not correct, and the centrality of human freedom. Despite being a soldier, he hated war and carried a deep guilt to his death over those he had killed and those who died under his command. Even given his commitment to liberal democracy, this stemmed from the sincere belief that, while deeply flawed, it was the best choice for people to live free from fear of the state. It was the best balance that people could achieve given the limitations of human nature and the necessary evil that is government. In contrast to Reinhardt, Yang freely let others into his life and committed himself fully to his relationships. So Yang was fairly open. He was just introverted and kind of socially awkward. But like, if you would go up to Yang and ask him a personal question, he'd probably answer you honestly and in depth. It's just a lot of people found him very confusing and enigmatic. It's more kind of a confusion where you have a friend who's just so smart and eccentric that you just don't really get what they're talking about, rather than someone who was whose true nature you couldn't really know. Yang ultimately didn't care about his legacy, and as I said, probably would have laughed at the circumstances of his death. Whether history remembered him or not was of little importance, as long as the people he loved could be happy and the ideas he lived for endured. What more could one man ask for? And so, epilogue. As to what became of Reinhardt's empire and the new autonomous republic, who can say? Did the empire eventually evolve into a constitutional monarchy? Did the republic once again fall under the sway of ultranationalists? Perhaps Reinhardt's death shattered the empire and ushered in another round of civil war. History never stops. Great men live or die. Empires rise and fall and will continue to do so long as mankind continues to draw breath. After all, in every time, in every place, the deeds of men remain the same.